Something happens to people who grew up in the 90s. A specific wiring, a specific way of seeing the world, that nobody who came after fully understands. You went outside until the streetlights came on. You had 3 TV channels and somehow never got bored. You were unreachable, and that was completely normal. And now, decades later, psychology is discovering that growing up in that specific era created something genuinely different in the people who lived it. Developmental psychologists call the years between 7 and 14 the critical imprinting window. Whatever surrounds you in those years shapes how you interpret everything else for the rest of your life. This is called autobiographical memory formation, and research confirms that memories from this exact window feel more vivid, more emotional, and more defining than memories from any other period of your life. Boredom tolerance, real boredom. The kind where you sat staring at the ceiling for 20 minutes and then invented something to do. That muscle barely exists in anyone born after 2000. Second, delayed gratification. You recorded your favorite song from the radio, finger hovering over the record button, waiting for the DJ to stop talking. That kind of patience rewired you. You didn't stream. You waited all week for one episode. One episode. And that wait made you value it in a way that infinite content never can. Third, conflict resolution without a screen. When you had a fight with a friend, you couldn't send a text. You had to show up, knock on the door, look them in the eye. That builds something text messages never will. Fourth, a relationship with uncertainty. You didn't know if your friend was home. You just went. You didn't know if the plan would work. You just tried. Uncertainty wasn't a problem. It was just Tuesday. Fifth, physical memory. Your body remembers things your mind has forgotten. The specific weight of a Game Boy. The resistance of a VHS tape rewinding. These aren't just memories. They live in your hands. Here's something nobody quite says. People who grew up in the 90s carry a specific kind of grief, not for people, for a pace of life that simply no longer exists anywhere. Psychologists call this chronological displacement, the sense that the time you belong to is not the time you're currently living in. Most 90s kids feel this at least occasionally. Many feel it constantly. There's also something called the reminiscence bump, a well-documented psychological phenomenon where humans remember more from ages 10 to 25 than any other period. For 90s kids, that bump lands entirely in the decade that defined them. Saturday morning cartoons were not entertainment. They were a weekly ritual that structured your entire sense of time. Waking up early, voluntarily, for something you loved. That's a relationship with joy most adults have lost. The school playground was its own civilization. No adults managing it, no cameras, no supervision apps. You negotiated, argued, made rules, broke them, and somehow figured it out. There was also something the 90s gave you that nobody manufactured intentionally. Genuine mixed-age friendship. Older kids taught you things. Younger kids looked up to you. That hierarchy built real social intelligence. Not the curated kind. Here's what that childhood actually built. Adults who can sit with discomfort, who don't need constant stimulation, who can be in a room with no signal and not panic. They also built adults who feel a specific friction with how fast everything moves now. Not because they can't keep up, but because they remember when speed wasn't the point, depth was. And there's a loyalty wiring that research consistently finds in this generation. 90s friendships, the ones made before social media, were built on showing up physically. That creates a bond type that digital connection genuinely cannot replicate. But here's what nobody says about 90s kids. Some of that nostalgia isn't warmth, it's avoidance. Using the past as a place to live because the present feels harder to inhabit. There's also a real tension this generation carries. The world they were promised, a stable job, a house, a linear path forward, didn't arrive. And the gap between what was expected and what came instead, that gap has a psychological cost. Here's the reframe. The 90s didn't just give you memories, it gave you a reference point, a lived experience of what life feels like when it moves slowly enough to actually be felt. That reference point is not a burden, it's a calibration. You know what genuine connection feels like. Because you've had it, you know what real boredom produces because you've lived it. That knowledge is rare now.
The world needs people who remember what it felt like before everything became instant. Who carry that slowness as a lived skill, not just a preference. You are one of those people. Drop a comment if you grew up in the 90s, and tell me what's the one thing from that decade you genuinely miss the most. And if this felt like someone finally understood your generation, don't forget to subscribe. Psychology Explained Simply.